we'll start. If anybody has any comments or questions about anything we learned yesterday or days before that, please feel free to make those comments or ask any questions.
I hope you're starting with 18b1. The Gemara, no?
We are starting with I'm going to start again from the Gemara. Yeah, I'll do Chazara on the Mishnah just to refresh everybody's mind outside, okay. and then we'll start from the Gemara. We'll start from the beginning of the Gemara. Just it helps to keep everything flowing.
Right.
The whole Tum and Tahara, the purity and impurity, and how one becomes pure is a whole. We call it a whole sugya. It's a whole.
It was complicated in brachot too.
Right. So it's important to keep the flow, to keep reminding everybody the principles of Tum and Tahara, so that when we learn in the Gemara, we understand the questions and we understand the answers and we understand the proofs that we're trying to bring. And if they're similar and if they're not similar, it's all going to come back to understanding the principles of how things work. 1 second. I just want to take one second. I'll be back in 1 minute. Just 1 second. Okay. All right. Let's get started. I just have to look something up, and all good. Okay. So now, just to do a brief review of the Mishnah. The Mishnah here is speaking about the obligation to wash one's hands. Why would one have to wash one's hands? So it's all based upon a special decree of the Chachamim. The Chachamim say that because hands are usually occupied, and if a person is not careful with those hands, so before they go and eat any bread, whether it's chulin or maisa or truma or kodesh or touch the mechatos, one has to have at least netilas yadayim when it comes to chulin and maisa and truma. But when it comes to kodesh, which those are the sacrifices, then if you're going to touch those, you need to go and immerse those hands into a mikvah. And when it comes to actually touching the mechatos, for that, it's not enough to immerse your hands into a mikvah, but your whole body has to go into a mikvah. So that's what we said with regards to washing of hands. And then we went on to say that when a person goes and immerses, he has to have specific intention for what level of kedusha he wants this immersion to be helpful for. So if he only had in mind that it should allow him to eat chulin, it will not count as an immersion for anything that is higher than that level, like Meiser Sheni or Truma and so on and so forth. In all the other levels, if he only had for one level, it won't count for the levels above that. However, if you immerse for the most strict, for the most stringent, it will cover all the ones that are beneath it. And likewise, in all cases. So if you're going to have in mind when you immerse that you should be able to eat truma, you'll be able to eat chulin and ma'aser sheni as well. So that's what we said. And then we went on to say that there's something called tumas midras. Tumas midras is when a person sits or stands or leans on something that is usually sat upon or leaned upon, whether it's a bed or a chair or a mat, sometimes some clothes, then those things can contract tuma. And so we say that when it comes to the different levels that a person is careful with regards to protecting his hands from contracting any tumah, right? If you are someone who only is careful with let's say truma, then even though you're very careful with truma, somebody who has to be careful for the level of kodesh, if you if that person touches your clothes, then they become a midrash for that level, and so on, working its way up to mechatos. And we give some examples in the Mishnah of people like Yesi ben Yeezer, who was the most pious when it came to being careful with his hands in terms of truma, but nevertheless, we considered articles of his clothing to be a midrash for somebody who's careful with kodesh. And we gave another example of Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgada, who was always careful to eat his food on the level of the taharas hakodesh. However, when it comes to mechatas, if somebody was to touch the clothes of Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgada, the gezerah of the Rabbanan is that that person will now become a midrash for a chatas, and so therefore he would have to go and immerse in a mikvah. So that's what we said in the Mishnah. If there are any questions about the concepts of rishon l'tumah, sheni l'tumah, and so on and so forth, now's a good time to ask. And if there are no questions, then I think we will move to the Gemara.
One thing.
Yep.
I wonder why the same food, if it's called Ma'aser Sheni, might have different stages of Tuma, Sheni or Shlishi, and the same food when it's called Chulin or whatever that, or Bikurim, it's only Tuma Sheni.
So we explained yesterday that all of this that we're speaking about is gezeres of the Chachamim to create a greater awareness and sensitivity to Tumah. So, for example, when we say that a person's hands become Sheni L'Tumah, right? The Chachamim said, when is this going to apply and when is it not going to apply? And more importantly, can this be passed on to make something else Tumah? Because the way it works in the Torah, right, is you have Avi Avodas Tumah, right? Avi Avodas Tumah is a dead person, and that has the greatest strength in terms of spreading Tumah, right? Now, if a person has been touched by a corpse, meaning you touch a corpse, then you become an Av HaTumah, and there's something called Metame. That means that not only do you become Tameh, but you have the ability to make something else Tameh. Now, although the thing that you touch is going to come to be a level lower than you, but nevertheless, you have the ability to pass on this Tumah. However, it all depends with regards to what we are speaking. What do I mean by that? I mean, we don't say that with regards to Chulin or with regards to Ma'aser Sheni, right? That it goes past Sheni. It doesn't go past Sheni. You don't have a Shlishi L'Tumah that's going to then invalidate the Chulin or the Ma'aser Sheni, right? We don't say that.
Okay.
We only apply that to things like Truma, okay? And with Truma itself, it only goes to a certain point. It doesn't go past Shlishi, right? Only Kodesh goes past Shlishi and Revi. And all of this is created in a system that's trying to help you become sensitive to the different degrees of Tumah, understanding how you have to be aware of these things when it comes to handling different kinds of things. And we're going to see much, much later on in the Gemara how this actually impacts whether or not we trust an Am Haaretz when it comes to Truma and other things of that, other things when it and Kodesh and so on. whether
Yeah,
we put them or not. In fact, Rashi tells us over here, it's very interesting. If you go to the Rashi,
I don't read Rashi.
okay, so I'll just tell you outside. Rashi tells us the reason why the Gemara turns at this point to Tumah Tahara is because at the end of the third chapter, we're ultimately going to get to a point where we speak about how some of these stringencies are relaxed when it comes to Yom Tov for an Am Haaretz. So first we have to introduce all the laws about Tumah Tahara. We've got to get our heads wrapped around what is allowed and what isn't allowed, what becomes Rishon, what becomes Sheni, and so on. Once you've got all of that straight, at the end of the Masechta, we're going to come and tell you something that's negated to Yom Tov, right? This tractate is about a Yom Tov. So it's coming to tell us that on a Yom Tov, all the things that we usually, and not all the things, but many of the things that we usually are suspicious when it comes to an Am Haaretz, we relax those concerns and we accept and we trust them with regards to these, that they're careful with their hands when it comes to truma and when it comes to kodesh during Yom Tov. Okay, so that's what we're building up to, but that comes much later on. But in order to get there, we first have to understand all of this. Okay. So, starting from the Gemara, Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis, in the article is 18b3. It's about halfway down the Amud. Okay, just third way down the Amud. Okay, so now the Mishnah we said, what did it say? That when it comes to Chulin and Ma'aser Sheni, right, and Truma, they all require washing your hands before eating, before getting involved in them, before eating them, as we'll see, the different things ultimately that we end up concluding about when you do have to wash and when you don't have to wash. So first thing we do is we're going to ask a question from another Mishnah. It says, when it comes to chulin and maaseh, mibo netilas yadayim, do they really need to have? Do they require washing your hands? Ramini, I'm going to ask you a question. Where from another Mishnah? There's a Mishnah in Bikurim, and what does it say over there? It says as follows. Hatruma v'habikurim. There are certain laws that only apply to Bikurim and Truma, right? And as we'll see, they don't apply to Chulin and Ma'aser Sheni. So what are the laws that we're going to say are special for Truma and Bikurim? It says, Chayav Malay and Misa. Somebody came along and he ate them knowingly, right? He did this intentionally. Then he's Chayav Misa, because it's forbidden for anybody who's not a Kohen to eat Bikurim or Truma. Now, in addition to the fact that you have to pay the kohen back because that's literally not yours and you should not have consumed it, so you have to pay him back. But in addition to that, you add upon it a penalty of a fifth. You add a fifth. That is if you ate them unintentionally, right? If you ate them unintentionally, then although you're not chayiv misa, right? Nevertheless, you have to add a fifth. But also, l'zorim, they're forbidden to non-kohenim. And they are the property of a kohen. Now, what does that mean? Is the property of a kohen? When we say that they're the property of a kohen, Rashi says what this means is that he really fully owns them. That he can even go and he can betroth a woman with them, and he can acquire a slave or property impure animal if he wants with this truma, because it belongs to him. He can do whatever he wants with it. Now, and with regards to this bikurim and truma, if, for example, one nut, right, that belongs to truma or bikurim falls into a pile of nuts, right? So now, the only way you can nullify it is if you have 100 other nuts, and this one fell into that 100, so now there's 101, and the reason why we say it's oilin, right, they are raised up, is because you've got to take one out, and you've got to give it to the kohen, right? However, the others are not considered to be all truma and bikurim. If it were less than 100, then they would all be considered truma. No one can eat it besides a kohen. Okay, and this is what we brought the Mishnah for now. Utu'unin nitilas yadayim, and they require washing your hands before dealing with them. V'hariv shemesh, and also one who's immersed himself. If he has become impure, so he has to wait for sunset before partaking in them. So the Mishnah says these apply only for Truma and Bikurim, whereas when we talk about Maisa Sheni, how much more so when it comes to Chulin, that these laws do not apply. But what do we see over here? We see that we mentioned the idea of washing hands, and we're saying that it only applies to Bikurim and Truma, and it doesn't apply to Maisa Sheni or to Chulin. The Gemara, Kasha, Maisa. So we have a contradiction over here from the Maisa in our Mishnah versus the Maisa in this Mishnah. And so too, we have a question with regards to Kasha Chulin, Chulin. This question with the Chulin in our Mishnah versus the Chulin in that Mishnah, that we say that we have to wash our hands. So when it comes to Maisa, on Maisa, we're going to have a potential solution, no problem. With regards to the Maisa on Maisa, that's not going to be a problem. We can resolve the two because we can attribute one Mishnah to Rabbi Meir, and we can attribute another Mishnah to the Rabbanon because they disagree with regards to Maisa. And we'll see exactly how. Rabbi Meir, this one is Rabbi Meir, Rabbanon, and this Mishnah is according to the rabbis. Ditnan. But we learned in the Mishnah, Kol hata'un bias mayim midivrei seifrim, anything that requires immersion in the water of a mikvah under rabbinical law, which means what? Anything that is tahar under biblical law. But it's tameh under rabbinical law and is a sheni, right? Because when the rabbis instituted that you become impure, your hands become impure, they only made it to the level of sheni. Right, they didn't make it a rishon or an av. Is we say that anything that requires immersion in the water from the chachamim, we say is metames hakodesh. It contaminates kodesh through contact, or poiseles truma, and it invalidates truma. Now, what's the difference between the word metame and poisel? Metame means, this is just good to know in general. Metame means not only is it impure, but it makes something else able to pass on that impurity. Poisel means that if it touches this next thing will not pass it on to a thing after that, but it itself becomes invalid. Does that make sense? Yes? Again.
It makes the first things invalid?
If I say I'm metame something, it means I am passing down a level of tumah to this thing that I touch, that it in turn can make something else impure, although to a lower level. Whereas poisel means that when I touch this thing, that thing becomes invalid for kedusha, but it cannot pass it on to something else. Okay? That makes sense?
But it itself is not kosher anymore, and
correct.
Will
so
not be.
let's say I am sheni, right? And I touch truma, so I'm poisel truma. Now the truma, if that touches something else, it cannot pass on. It cannot pass that on to make it the further thing, the third thing, tomei. But it itself becomes puzzle. You cannot use it anymore. Okay? For kodesh, you have to burn it. Okay, so we said that anything that requires immersion in the water under rabbinical law contaminates kodesh through contact. And it invalidates truma consumption through contact. But it's permitted in regards to chulin and maise. Okay, Divrei Rabbi Meir. This is the words of Rabbi Meir. The Chachamim say, but Maisa, that, excuse me, the Chachamim Eisrim, the Chachamim forbidden with regards to Maisa. So we see over here that we could say that our Mishnah, which says you need to wash your hands for Maisa Sheni, follows the Chachamim, right? Because you cannot eat it before washing your hands. Masha Enkain, with regards to the Mishnah that says you don't have to wash your hands. So with regards to Maisha, we could say that follows the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says he doesn't need to, for that the necessity to wash your hands does not extend to Maisa and to Chulin. But chulin kasha. But with regards to chulin, against chulin, the chulin of our Mishnah was the chulin in that Mishnah. Even the Chachamim would agree that you don't have to wash your hands. So who's it going to go according to in this Mishnah, where we say that you do have to wash your hands? And for the Gemara, loy kasha. It's not a question. It's not a contradiction. Why? Because our two Mishnahs are talking about two separate cases. One, our case is bachila. You're planning to eat the food, and since you're planning to eat the food, then you've got to wash your hands. Kan benegia. But the other Mishnah, which says that it only applies to things that are of a high level of kedusha, but not ma'aser sheni and not chulin. That's talking about touching it. Touching it doesn't require washing. Okay, and this is where we got up to yesterday. So now, says the Gemara, 1 second, not happy with your answer. Maskivlo, Rav Shimi Bar Ashi objected. Adkan lepligi rabbanon alei Reb Meir. So far, the rabbis did not dispute Reb Meir elabachila the Maisa, except in regards to the eating of Maisa Sheni. Whereas we say that Reb Meir permits eating Maisa Sheni with unrinsed hands, and the rabbis actually forbid it. Aval benegi and the Maisa ubachila the chulin. When you talk about the touching of Maisa Sheni and the eating of chulin, like pligi, they don't argue. So how can you come along and say that you're going to make a difference between the two? One is about touching and one is about eating. They don't disagree with regards to with regards to touching Maisa Sheni and the eating of chulin. So therefore, your answer doesn't work. We've got to find a better answer that can explain how our case, our Mishnah is different than the case that we brought from Bikurim. So he says the answer is, and for the Gemara, Ela idi v'idi b'achila. Both of them are talking about achila. We're not talking about one is negia, one's achila, one's touching, one is eating. Both cases, the Mishnah over there and the Mishnah over here is talking about eating. V'loy kasha. It's not a question. Kan ba'achila denamo. Our Mishnah is talking about bread. And when it comes to eating bread, that's when we require washing our hands. And kan ba'achila de peire. And over here, meaning the Mishnah Bikurim, that's talking about when you want to eat other produce like fruits. And there you do not require to wash your hands when it comes to chulin or Maisa Sheni when you're just eating fruit. When you're going to eat bread, whether it's chulin or Maisa Sheni, you have to wash your hands. But when it comes to other produce, when it comes to fruit, for example, then you don't need to wash your hands. And not only do you not need to wash your hands, but the Gemara goes a step further. The Amar of Rav Nachman says, Kol hanetel yodav leperis, whoever does wash their hands before eating produce, right? This is somebody who is arrogant. Why? Because the Chachamim never require you to wash your hands for fruit. And you're going to go ahead and say, I'm going to be more careful than what the Chachamim required. That is a sense of arrogance. And so therefore we see this is a good answer. This is a good answer. The Mishnah that says that you have to wash your hands for chulin and for maisa is talking about washing your hands for bread. The Mishnah that says that chulin and Maisa Sheni is different than the higher levels, in that you don't have to wash your hands, it's not talking about bread, it's talking about produce. And over there, when it comes to Truma and Kodesh, then you do have to take that extra step and wash your hands, even when it's talking about produce and not bread, but not with regards to chulin. Now, you might ask yourself, but what about on Pesach? Don't we wash our hands when we're about to eat fruit? We take a vegetable and we dip it in salt water and we go wash our hands. So the answer is that that's not just eating fruit. That's eating fruit that you're going to dip into liquid. That's a whole different ball game. That's a whole different concept. Here we're talking about just fruit. You're picking up fruit or produce, and you're just going to eat it the way it is without dipping it into any liquids. In that case, the Chachamim say there's no need whatsoever to wash your hands before you touch the fruit, or before you eat the fruit. Okay. Now, we mentioned in our Mishnah.
Rabbi,
Yes.
can the fruit itself be washed?
The fruit itself can be washed. It can be washed. However, as you're going to see, there's a whole thing with regards to washing fruit. When you wash fruit, then that's called hechsher eichlin. Maybe now's a good time to explain this. Okay, food can only become tamei after it becomes wet via one of 7 liquids. What are the 7 liquids? So you have water, you have tal, the dew, then you have blood, you have oil, you have milk, you have honey, and wine. Those are the 7 mashkin. Those are the 7 liquids that prepare food to become tamei, right? However, even when that happens, it's not so simple. It has to be that you have intention. You have intention for it to now become susceptible to tumah. If you didn't have intention when you immerse it in the water, then it is not susceptible to tumah yet. Okay, so let's look at the Gemara. We're going to come and deal with these issues as they come up. Says them. So we mentioned in our Mishnah. What did we mention in our Mishnah with regards to immersing into the mikvah? When you immerse into a mikvah, you have to have in mind what level you want to achieve in terms of your purity. And if you didn't have it in mind, then we said if a person goes into the water and he doesn't have anything in mind, it doesn't count at all. So now the Gemara discusses whether when you wash your hands, does it need intention? Or if water is poured onto your hands without any intention, does that count? Rabbanon, the rabbi told in the Brisa, Hanoitel Yodov, somebody who washes their hands, Niskaven, if he had intention to become pure as a result, Yodov Tahiris, then his hands are Tahar. Loy Niskaven, but if he did not have intention, then Yodov Tameis, his hands remain Tamei. V'chein, and the same halacha applies, Hamakbil Yodov, somebody who immerses his hands into the mikvah. Niskaven, if he had intention, then Yadav Tahiris, then his hands are pure. Lo niskaven, but if he did not have intention, then we say Yadav Tmeis, then his hands remain Tamei. Frag the Gemara, how is this possible? Well, Tanya, didn't we not learn in a different brisa? It says in a different brisa, Bein niskaven, Bein lo niskaven, whether he had intention or whether he did not have intention, then what do we say? We say Yadav Tahiris. His hands are tar. So it seems to be a blatant contradiction between one brisa and another brisa, whether or not you need to have intention or not. Rabbi Nachman. So Rabbi Nachman says, "Like kasha, it's not a question. Why? Kan in the second brisa over here is lechulin. We're talking about when you're washing your hands just for chulin. Washing your hands for chulin, you don't have to have anything in mind. So long as you wash your hands, you're good, right?" However, but over here, here in the brisa that you brought, where it says, the brisa we just mentioned, that when you wash your hands and you didn't have in mind, then your hands remain tamei, that's talking with regards to Ma'aser Sheni. So, chulin doesn't require intention, but Ma'aser Sheni does. Okay, Frank the Gemara, how do you know this? How do you know that chulin doesn't require kavanah? Maybe chulin does require kavanah. So he said, no, we know this. Ditzanan, because we learned in the Mishnah. It's an interesting case. Gal shenitlash, if a wave, right, became detached, uboy aborim saw, and it had within it 40 saw, which means as follows. You have a massive wave which separates itself from the rest of the sea and comes crashing down But how much water was in this wave as it came crashing down? 40 saw. Now we know that 40 saw is the size that's required of a mikvah. How do we get 40 saw? We get 40 saw because it's 1 amma by 1 amma in the height of 3 ammas. So that is what we say a normal person fits into that size of a box. And we say the amount of water that it takes to fill up that size is 40 saw. And so from there we say that's the minimum requirement in order for a person to become pure with. So now if you have a big wave, separates itself from the sea and comes crashing down, right? We say that v'nofal ala odom ala kelim, and it fell on a person or on kelim, right? So the question is, what happens to the kelim and what happens to the person that had this wave that separated itself that came crashing down? So we say tar, and they become tar. Now, here's the thing. Did the kelim have intention to become tar? Did the person have intention to become tar? Ostensibly, no. This is a freak thing, right? That a wave detaches itself from. In other words, if I walk out into the sea, right, which the sea is a kosher mikvah, then you could say I had intention to become pure. But if I'm standing on the side, right, and all of a sudden this comes and washes over me, right, without my intention, we say that they become tar. And now the Gemara comes along and wants to learn out the din of an adam from the vessel. It says, Katani, we learn, Katani adam dumya the kelim. The Mishnah teaches us the case of the person parallel to the case of the utensils. So now by grouping them together, right, it seems that the circumstances are similar. And now, ma kelim delay miskaravin, just like the utensils do not intend to immerse themselves. Obviously, they have no mind of their own. Af adam delay mechavin. So too, we're trying to say that a person does not need to have a kavana to become tar. Again, we're not talking about becoming tar on a deraisa level, on a biblical level. We're speaking over here where a person wants to become tahar for chulin, right? So if a person is standing there and all of a sudden this big wave comes and falls on him, just like the kelim become tahar, so too the person becomes tahar. Yes.
Okay. Maybe this is a stupid question, but in order for the person to be tahor, he has to be completely naked. In
Right.
order for the entire, for it to wash over him, okay? And so what human being would be standing on the side completely naked unless he had the intention of being washed over, unless he was going to the sea in order to bathe in a mikveh. I mean, nobody walks around naked.
So there's two things to say over here. Number one, what you just said is similar to the Gemara's response to this whole idea, which we're going to read in a minute. And the second thing is, it's not so simple that you have to be completely naked. It is possible that if a person has loose clothes on, then if they enter into a mikvah, then the mikvah can work. And that's why, for example, you need to ask a Rav first before you decide anything. But it is possible if a woman will not be comfortable to go to the mikveh in any other way than with wearing a loose bathing suit in the sea, right? Because there's no mikveh around, there's no changing room, there's no, it's interesting because when I was in Hawaii, so on the Big Island, there's no mikveh there. So my wife had to go to the mikveh, and there were other people who came over there and needed to go to the mikveh, and my wife went to be the mikveh lady over there and took them out into the sea. And but no, they went far out enough to be able to get undressed. But what if a person wouldn't want to get undressed? So it's not so simple that the clothes will be a chatzitza. If they're very loose clothing and all the water can seep through. So if a person is wearing, like in the olden days, they just have this a robe, so it's not tight on their body. Possibly it would count. as an immersion. But like I said, the Gemara is going to say exactly more or less what you said, that we can't make this suggestion that the Gemara is trying to make right now. So let's right now we're saying it right now. So says the Gemara, how do you know that that the Mishnah is coming to teach me that this this Brisa is coming to teach me that the Mishnah, that this Mishnah is coming to teach me that we're learning out the person from the Keli. Dilma b'yoshiv u'metzape perhaps we're dealing with a case where the person is sitting on the shore, like you said, and he's waiting for he sees it's a stormy day, and he sees that we're going to have a major wave that's going to come and jump out because of the wind and the storm, etc. So he's standing there waiting for it. So you can't say that he doesn't have kavanah. And now, what's the Mishnah telling us? V'kelim dumya da'adam, and we put the case of the vessels together with the adam. Right? Why? Because we're saying the opposite. Ma adam Dvar kavana, just as a person is capable of intent, of kelim the mechaven lahu. When we speak about the kelim in the Mishnah, is talking about that the owner had intent for them to become kosher, right? So therefore, what you're saying cannot be a proof. Why did we just mention this? We mentioned this because we're trying to say that from where do we know that you don't need to have kavanah for chulin when you immerse, right? When you wash your hands. So we're saying we learned it from this case of this big wave that comes and washes over. And so we must be talking about a guy who didn't have intention. So the Gemara rejects that and says, no, he did have intention, or at least it's plausible to say that he did have intention. And so therefore the Mishnah could not be teaching us from here that one doesn't have to have intention. Now, if you're going to ask, right? That when if a person is sitting and is anticipating the wave, is the maim lememra. So then what's the chiddush of the Mishnah? We have an assumption, generally speaking, that when a Mishnah says something, it's coming to tell us something that we don't already know. If we already know it, then what's the point of the Mishnah? The Mishnah is not going to tell us things that have already been taught. So we know already that if a person has in mind, right, to become tar, and he immerses into a mikvah, right, that he becomes tar. So why would I think any differently? So therefore, the initial svara of the Gemara by bringing this Mishnah is to say, this must be the chiddush of the Mishnah. Because otherwise, what's the Mishnah coming to tell me? I already know that if a person has in mind that he's going to be tar. So, and for the Gemara, no, there's still a reason why the Mishnah comes to tell us that we tell you that this person becomes tar. Why? Because had the Mishnah not told us that he's tar, I might have thought that what? Ligzar. Maybe the Chachamim should make a gezerah dilma ostel mitbal bechardolis shel g'shamim. Because if a person waits for a wave to come over him, and then he becomes tahor, although that is okay, he might assume that in a similar instance, he will also have a valid tevilah. And what is that? That's in the case where a person wants to have this tevilah, an immersion in a torrent of rainwater that's coming down on a very steep mountain slope. So if a person is standing there somewhere on the incline of the descent of the mountain, and there's a lot of water rushing down from this torrent of rainwater, so he might think that he is actually going to have a valid tevilah. Why would he think that? He would think that because he learned somewhere else that if I have a big gal, a big wave come over to me that separates from the sea, if I have in mind that, and then I can be yotza. But the halacha actually is that in the case of the rainwater, it's not kosher. Why is it not kosher? Because when it comes to rainwater, it has to be in one place. It cannot be something that is moving. It cannot be something that's moving. So we might have thought that maybe we're going to make a gezerah with regards to this wave that's detached from the sea, so that no one should ever come to make the mistake about the torrent of rainwater running down a steep mountain slope, comes along the Mishnah and says it's kosher, that we don't make that gezerah, right? One second. Just want to see Rashi for a second. Okay. Inami, alternatively, maybe the reason why the Mishnah comes and tells us that it's kosher is to tell us about a different thing. Is nigja roshin atu kefin. That maybe we would say that you're going to decree that we're going to say that this immersion that took place is invalid because we want to say that the heads of the detached waves should become invalid on account of the arches. What is this? What does this mean? What does this mean? When you have a wave, the wave can sometimes come as an arch, right? Can come over the person, right? Now the question is, if you stood under the head of a detached wave as it fell to the earth, is it kosher? So we would say that in that case, it is kosher. Whereas if you were in the arches, meaning, one second. So he says over here at the bottom, he says that where one extended or threw a utensil in skyward into the arching middle section of a detached wave, right? So then we would say that that's invalid. So maybe we would make a gezerah from our case because we're worried about another case. Kamash Malon comes along the Mishnah and tell us that this case is kosher. The legas rinan, we don't make a decree one for the other. Now, Frey the Gemara, 1 second. From where do you know the how do you know that you cannot perform immersion in the arches of detached waves? So he says the Tanya was torn in the Brisa, matbil and barashin. We immerse utensils in the heads of detached waves, but we do not immerse them in the arches of those waves. Why? The fish because one cannot perform immersion mid-air. What does this mean? Rashi says, because the Torah never says that a mikvah of the air can be a tefillah. It's got to be a mikvah in the ground. When we talk about a mikvah, right? The mikvah that the Torah refers to is a mikvah that's in the ground. So therefore, even if you could have a body of water that could, for a moment, be in the air, that would never qualify as a proper mikvah. So, if that's the case, we've just now discounted this proof that we tried to bring to teach me that chulin, when you are washing your hands, you do not have to have intention. So then the question is, okay, so what is the source that you do not have to have intention when it comes to chulin? Ella, says the Gemara, Ella Maha. We're going to learn it from here. What does it say? The Tanan, we learned in a Mishnah. What happens if the water, a fruit fell into a channel of water? So you have in the field these like a channel of water, right, surrounding the field, I suppose, and there's enough water over there for a person to put his hands into it. And if he was a sheni, the Rabbanan that is, if he was a sheni l'tumah, his hands needed to be washed for a particular reason. he wanted to be on a higher level of kedusha, let's say for Ma'aser Sheni, right? Uposhat Mishi Yodov Timeus and Natalon. And so you had this fruit that was in the water, and he put his hands to reach into the water to take the fruit out. So what is the result of this whole thing? The result is Yodov Tahiris, his hands become tahar, or Peiros Einon Bechiyutan. And the produce are not included in the law that is called Chiyutan. What's the law of Chiyutan? The law is like this. I said before that when a person takes fruit, the fruit itself can never contract tuma unless it was first came into contact with liquid, right, after it becomes wet by one of the 7 liquids. Obviously, one of them is water. So now, the thing is like this. It says in the pasuk, ki yutan ma'im al zera, right? Now, when you will place, when water will be placed on the seed, right? And through that, as a result, it will be able to contract tuma. So the word yutan is spelt not yud, vav, Tov, Nun, but rather it's spelled Choser without a Vav, and therefore, instead of reading it Yutan, you could also read it as Yitain, Ki Yitain. Now, Yitain means when you will give it intentionally, when it will be placed intentionally. And we learned from that in order for something to be susceptible to Tumah, it has to be intentionally dipped into the water. It has to be it has to come into contact with the water intentionally. So now, if a fruit fell into water, so when it fell into water, it wasn't intentional. So therefore, it doesn't yet contract any tumah. So when a person puts their hand into this channel of water, right, to get the fruit, although his hands become tahar, but the fruit itself doesn't contract tumah because it doesn't have this idea of kiyutan. So now, what's the first thing we said about this case? We say that that by putting your hands in, for what purpose? To get out a fruit, nevertheless makes your hands tar. So it seems from this clear that when you put your hands, even though you didn't have intention to purify your hands, nevertheless for chulin, it's okay. Everybody understand? Yeah, so far so good. So he says, 1 second, Esvei, Rabba Rav Nachman. Rabba challenged Rav Nachman from our Mishnah. Says, if somebody immersed himself for chulin and intended to purify himself only for chulin, what do we say? He's prohibited from eating ma'aser sheni. Why? Because he only had in mind what? He only had in mind chulin. Now, huchzak in. The Mishnah implies that it's only if he intended to immerse himself to eat chulin that he's permitted to do so. But loy huchzak loy. If he did not intend, so he's not permitted. So therefore, you have what you just brought with the guy putting his hand into the channel to bring out the fruit, and you're saying he becomes automatically tahar, and yet our Mishnah seems to say that if a person immersed just for chulin, right, then he's established to be tahar for chulin. But if he didn't have in mind, then he's not established, and so therefore from our Mishnah it seems to be clear that if you didn't have intention, even for chulin, it's not good enough. So how do you understand it? And for the Gemara, this is what it must be saying. This is what the Tana of the Mishnah must be saying. Even though a person is he intended to immerse himself for chulin, also l'maisa, he's nonetheless prohibited from eating maisa. What's going on? What's going on is like this. When a person goes into a mikvah, according to what we're trying to say right now, whether he had intention or whether he didn't have intention, he should be permitted to eat chulin, right? However, if he had intention to be tahar for chulin, he can never go and take that a step further He can never go and take that a step further and now consume Meiser Sheni, right? He cannot go up. He cannot go up from what he originally intended. Okay? So let's continue. And you're going to see it's all going to become clear in a minute, right? Says the Gemara, Eisvei, Rabba challenging Rav Nachman, Tova v'loy huchzak. If one immersed himself without intention, he ilu loy toval. It's as if he wasn't toval. So 1 second. You're telling me that the intention of the Mishnah was that what? That all you're trying to tell me is that if a person didn't have in mind for chulin, he's tar for chulin, but he's not able to take it a step higher and go to Meiser Sheni. That's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah actually says that if you immersed and you didn't have an intention for tahara, but for something else, then ki'ilu lo tavel, it's as if you didn't immerse at all. So he says, my lava ki'ilu lo tavel klal. Isn't the Mishnah saying it's as if he didn't immerse himself at all? So it's not even good for chulin. And for the Gemara, Allah. So Rav Nachman says, no, that's not what it's trying to say. But ki'ilu lo tavel lemaisa. It's as if he did not immerse himself for Meiser Sheni. But he did effectively immerse himself for chulin. Now, who sava dochi kamatchale?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
it sounds like when you tovel, you have something in mind. Now, the minimum you have in mind is chulin. And that's why they start from chulin. It couldn't be higher because even if you wanted to do it for higher, you had in mind for higher, for sure you are good for chulin.
Yeah, but as we go further in the Gemara, everything will start to fall into place, and we'll see how each thing actually has its gedorim, has its particular boundaries, and how it works. So,
okay,
the story in the Gemara at this point is that Rabbah thought that Rav Nachman is just like pushing him off, right? So who saw the dochi kamatchale? He thought that Rav Nachman was just pushing him off with his answer. But nafak dak v'ashkach. But he went out and he investigated, and then he discovered that Rav Nachman was indeed correct. Why? The Tanya, because it was taught in a brisa, taval. If one immersed himself and did not intend for tahara, also lemaisa umuta lechulin. He's forbidden to eat maisa, but he's permitted to eat chulin. So when we say that he's not huchzak, he's not huchzak at all, but he's not huchzak to eat. He's not huchzak to eat maisa.
Yeah.
Okay. The next piece that we're going to learn is, I at least for me, when I was learning this, right, it made this piece of the Gemara that we're learning now clearer. Okay, although it may not be directly connected, but I found that when I learned this next piece of Gemara, it helped me understand this piece of Gemara. So he says like this: what did we learn? We learned that somebody who immerses himself with intention for a lower level of kedusha is considered to be tamei for all higher levels. So Rabbi Lazar says, what happens like this? Toval v'Allah. Somebody who immersed himself into the mikvah, and then he came up from the mikvah, right? And here we're speaking about a case where he did not have an intention for what level of tahara he wants to purify himself. So we say about the guy, that after sending from the mikvah, he could still decide what level he wanted that immersion to count for. Okay, that's what we're saying. We're saying now, Frey the Gemara may say, I'm going to ask you a question. Yes.
Didn't we say something before that if an individual doesn't have in mind, then it's as if he didn't do anything?
Correct. That is correct. However, it seems that two things. Number one, we've just reinterpreted that Mishnah, right? that's what we just said 2 lines ago. We said that Rabbah thought that Rav Nachman was just pushing him off, but then he went out and he investigated and he found that Rav Nachman was correct and that there's an actual brisa that explains that if a person immersed and he didn't intend for any tahara, then what is prohibited for him? Only Ma'aser Sheni. But he's permitted now to eat chulin. In other words, that it does count for chulin, it just doesn't count for Ma'aser Sheni. So the way we should be reading the Mishnah when it says lo yuchzak, it doesn't count for anything, right? It means it doesn't count for anything in terms of a higher level than chulin, but for chulin it does count. That's how we explained it over here. But one second. Let me
Well, when you go to the mikvah, you have something in mind.
1 second. Yeah. So when it says ki'ilu lo toval, I just want to see something. Over here we're saying, 1 second. So yeah, so we're basically Rav Nachman is amending the brisa to say when it says ki'ilu lo toval, you have to add one word, ki'ilu lo toval lemaiser, not ki'ilu lo toval at all. Okay, so we're saying that the halacha is that if you went and immersed and you had nothing in mind, it's going to count for chulin, but not for anything higher than chulin. Okay. Right, the Gemara. So Rebbe Loza just said, yes.
But in situations like this, where the Gemara basically says something's missing, they normally would say and this is what it ought to say. So
right. No, I understand, but I guess because if you go back, it says ki'ilu. So so Rabbah is asking Rav Nachman, my love ki'ilu lo toval klal, because it doesn't say ki'ilu lo toval klal. It says ki'ilu lo toval. So he's asking, doesn't it mean ki'ilu lo toval klal? So when the michsa mechsra, right there, it's where it's clear that this is the intent, and therefore you need to actually amend what the wording of the version of the Mishnah is or the Brisa is. But here it seems that there's room to interpret one way or the other. Ki'ilu le'toval, you didn't end off. So he's asking, my love, ki'ilu le'toval klal. Says Rav Nachman loy, ki'ilu le'toval lemaisa. It's when it says ki'ilu le'toval, it means lemaisa. Anyway, it's a good question. I can try to look at it a little bit more afterwards and see whether there's any clarity I can get on that. But that's all I have for now. So we said now that Rebbe Loza says that if you went down and you immersed yourself and you come up, once you come up, right, you can intend to purify yourself to whichever level you want. So, for the Gemara Meisvei, they challenge this from a brisa. It says like as follows: "Eidehu ragle achaz b'mayim." If one still has his foot in the water, which means he's immersed, and he is coming up from the water, and he still has 1 foot left in the water. So we say, Huchzak ledover kal. If he originally had intention for a less stringent item, then machzik asma ledover chamor, he can still change for a more stringent item. But Allah, if he already came out, shuv einem machzik, he can no longer intend. So my love einem machzik klal. So why don't we understand this to say that he cannot make himself tahar on any level at all, meaning once you've left the mikvah, it's game over. While you were still in the mikvah, you can come along and you can decide one level or another level. But once you've left, you cannot change and decide anything. And for the Gemara, in other words, that would challenge Rabbi Elazar, who said once you've left the mikvah, you can decide any level you want. 1 second. It seems from this Mishnah or from this brisa that once you leave the mikvah, you can't change it all. And with the Gemara, it means as follows: you have to read the brisa like this. Oideyu, when you still have 1 foot in the water, even though he had an intention for a less stringent level, machzik, he could switch it for a higher level of tahara. But Allah, once he's ascended, then imla huchzak machzik. If he had not intended anything, then he can intend for a particular level. But huchzak ain't a machzik. But if he had intended for one particular level, he cannot then intend for another level. In other words, as follows: we're saying like this. We said in our Mishnah that when a person immerses in the mikvah, if he had in mind for one level, he cannot then eat a higher level. Right now, what we're saying is, right, in addition to that, we're saying that that's not absolute, which means if you're still in the mikvah and you originally had in mind for, let's say, chulin or maisa, you can go up a level and you could say before you leave the mikvah, you could do truma, that this going to the mikvah should be valid even to eat truma. However, once you left the mikvah, if you didn't have anything in mind, then we say that you can have intention for whatever level you want. But if you already had in mind, for example, you had in mind for chulin, and now you're out of the mikvah, so you cannot then bump it up once you've already left the mikvah.
So would you repeat that again, please?
Yeah. When a person goes into the mikvah, and he has in mind for a particular level that he wants to become tar for, so long as he has not left completely the mikvah, he can switch his mind and say, I want it actually to count for a higher level. But once you leave the mikvah, whatever you had in mind in the mikvah stays. You cannot then change it once you've left the mikvah. The exception to that rule is in a case where you went into the mikvah and you didn't have anything in mind. You didn't, in other words, when I say you had nothing in mind, I mean you didn't think which particular level of tahara I was immersing for. In that case, when you come out of the mikvah, you could say, oh, which level did I go to the mikvah for? I went to the mikvah for the level of kodesh. And that's fine because you didn't establish yourself as being tar for a lower level while you were in the mikvah. Okay? If you did that, then the only way to change that is while you're still in the mikvah. Once you've completely left the mikvah, whatever you had in mind in the mikvah, that's what stays. If you had nothing in mind,
Rabbi.
Yes.
So once you're in the mikvah and and your intent is for kodesh, you can also, once you leave the mikvah, you can still do chulin and ma'aseh sheni truma, right?
But you don't need to, because once you do kodesh, it includes everything below it.
Everything below, but I'm just saying it includes that. So
Yes, of course.
It's included.
Of course.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to stop here, and we'll continue in Mr. Hashem from here tomorrow. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to stay for any questions.
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi.
All right.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Hatzlacha Rabbi.
Bye-bye, everyone.